Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Environmental Coffee House. I am Sandy Shellis, and let's see if I can do this right. Welcome, everyone. I'm not going to stay on the whole time tonight because this is Jim Massa and Antonio Reed's show tonight. And I am just here because actually I'm going to introduce you guys to a video to start. And Antonio and Jim are going to get into it with the IPCC. And I hear a feedback. I hope it's not my channel. Huh. All right, listen, guys. I'm going to play the video. And I'm going to take us off. And let's go for it. Because I'm sorry, guys. I hear an echo and I have to fix it. All righty, let's go.
Congress has ignored the great existential threat of our time, and that is climate change. You don't have to believe me. Take a look at the IPCC report. If we do not act boldly and immediately all over this planet, the world that we will be leaving our children and grandchildren will be increasingly unhealthy and uninhabitable.
To the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Earth could exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming limit in 2 decades and 2 degrees by the middle of the century. The report released Monday shows the trend may be irreversible even if emissions are pulled to net zero.
Yes, the last assessment report in 2013, there have been important advances in climate science worldwide. During these years, climate scientists filled in gaps in observations of past climates. They improved climate models and developed new ways to combine many types of evidence. As a result, today, we have the clearest picture of how the Earth's climate functions and how human activities affect it.
All right, guys, there you go. I have an echo. I'm getting off. Welcome to Antonio, and take it away, because I'm off. Now I can't hear you. Can you guys hear him? What the hell is going on here? Echo. Something is definitely really wrong. Hang on, guys. This is the beauty of live. Okay. And he's gone. Jim, can we hear you? Jim, can you hear me? All right, let's see.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay. Hi, Antonio. Let's hear you.
Hello.
All right, guys. Well, that's the beauty of live. I can hear you now.
Okay. Hey, no echo.
No echo. Well, it was all Antonio's fault. All right. Well, listen. So it's okay. You saw the video. I'll show it again at the end. Anyway, guys, we have a good show. And I'm going to leave you now that we figured out the echo. Antonio Reed, Science Talk with Jim Mass. I can't help it. Because, Jim, do you know that you're in my phone as Science Talk with Jim Mass? I couldn't find your number because it wouldn't come up. All right, guys, have a good show. The format will be about 40 minutes of talk, and then I will come back for questions. Put up your questions with put two Qs. Two Qs and put your questions, and I will watch for the questions, collect them, and we will do them for the last 20 minutes. All right, because that's how I like to roll. All right, guys, see you later.
All right. Thank you, Sandy. And thank you, our viewers, for tuning into this week's Environmental Coffee House episode with me, obviously, and Jim Massa. Thank you for being here.
Good to see you again, Antonio.
Absolutely. So first and foremost, I guess I would be remiss if I didn't just mention in passing that my hearts and prayers and thoughts go out to the people who are being affected by Hurricane Ida, and also to the families affected by our foreign policy in Afghanistan. My part in today's episode is going to be focused on U.S. climate spending in line with its 2015 Paris Accord national pledge. In 2015, then President Barack Obama had offered to the Paris conference that the United States was going to limit its emissions by 25 to 30% of the 2010 level. At the time, the United States was roughly emitting between 4 to 5 billion tons of carbon dioxide emission into the atmosphere. At the time, this nearly caused the political failure of the Paris Accord. Many countries, including then Secretary Antonio Guterres, denounced the U.S. Plan as woefully inadequate. Again, that's lowering the U.S. emissions by 25 to 30% of the 2010 level by 2025. The Obama negotiators were able to convince the rest of the world at the time that this was the best offer on the table with a Republican-controlled Congress. The world actually accepted the position, which was actually probably very true. But actually, Obama at the time knew that this was largely just political speech for the UN. At home, U.S. spending, liberal commentators and conservative commentators had estimated that if we were to stay in line with lowering our carbon emissions as we pledged in the Paris Accord, the United States would roughly have to spend between $400 billion to $800 billion on climate annually for the next 10 years. So that's a $4 to $8 trillion of spending on U.S. infrastructure between 2015 and 2025. That was the estimated projection. What happened was the United States, Obama issued his clean energy plan, and that amounted between 20 to 30 billion dollars of spending, or roughly between 5 to 7% of the necessary spending level of the low end estimate, 400 billion a year. Right now, U.S. emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, have declined rather steadily, although our methane emissions have increased, kind of counterbalancing that. Right now, to catch you up to present, there are two offers on the table. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2018, in its special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius concluded that on the current trajectory of emissions, that we had 10 more years of emissions before we were to exhaust the entirety of our global carbon budget. Well, in response to that, we ought to have been spending in the United States, if we were going to stay in par now, at minimum $800 billion a year, and more likely to stay in line with our Paris Accords by 2030, we would have to spend $1.6 trillion a year on our infrastructure and decarbonization projects. So where this puts us today was with the Bernie Sanders reconciliation bill and the Biden, Joe Manchin Republican bipartisan bill. The bipartisan bill almost wholesale rejects the idea that the United States should acknowledge climate spending at all in its infrastructure. That's what's called bipartisan in the United States, or what CNN is deeming moderate. On the radical far left constituency in the United States, we have what Bernie Sanders' plan, which is the reconciliation bill the Democrats are pushing through. This plan spends $3.5 trillion on what the Democrats are calling human infrastructure, for which they've also packaged climate spending. Now, this is crucial to understand. In the United States, climate spending, we can't have a climate spending plan. Okay, there can't be a Green New Deal. And this started under Obama. That's why we didn't get a climate plan, we got an energy plan, a clean energy plan. And that's because not only do Republicans reject climate spending, so do the majority of Democrats. And there's just a recent tide in the Democratic Party in terms of congressional members and senators, in terms of spending on climate at all. And so what we got now is that in the so-called radical socialist agenda, we have between $500 billion to $1 trillion of climate spending over the next 10 years. So over the next 10 years, that means the United States will only be spending between 50 to 100 billion dollars a year on climate infrastructure and emissions mitigation. That total is 1/8 now. If we spend $1 trillion, is 1/8 the amount of money we need to actually be spending to meet what Antonio Guterres, the former Secretary of the UN, called woefully inadequate goals at the UN Paris Accords. So that's what we face. And I wanted to contextualize the political process to deal with the science, or what I would actually deem the political science that's coming out of the IPCC. In the US, mainly because most of our audience is living in the United States, needs to have a very clear understanding of where we are. In action, even the Bernie Sanders plan, which is highly unlikely to go through as is a full-out rejection of our obligation under the Paris Accords. And Jim, I'm going to then pass the mic over to you to talk about the science of the recent report, which is governing, or supposed to be governing, our understanding of the Paris Climate Accords and our pledges under the Accords.
Okay, well, thank you for the excellent summation and background that you just provided, Antonio. I'm sure it comes as no surprise going through the IPCC report that once again they are really underestimating the changes that have taken place. At least the IPCC is saying, "Oh, wow, things are bad," and things are being caused by humans. That's almost the first for them with these reports. However, as we discussed in the last time we were both on this podcast, the underestimation continues. When you look at, you might have noticed in the intro that Sandy played for tonight, there was a graph in there. And once again, the assumption was a linear increase. Whichever RCP, modeling that they went with, the increase is still linear, which is an underestimation right there. Going through the IPCC report, once again, the oceans, the effects of the oceans is really given short shrift. They do not really go into any detail as to what is happening. Yes, that would be that one there. You can see it's pretty much, that's a straight line. And it's supposed to be, we know that things are exponentiating. So right there you have an underestimation. They neglected to relay how dire things are because of all the heat content in the oceans. They, also again, downplay methane. And here's the other thing that really, just kind of ticked me off, to be honest. They said, the planet has warmed 1.2 degrees. Guess what they're doing now? And I was reading several papers on this very point today. They are now saying, planet's warmed 1.2 degrees compared to the 1850 to 1900 baseline. They moved the goalpost.
I think I don't know, 1850, and this is my understanding of baselines, and correct me if I'm wrong. When a scientist, a climatologist issue a baseline, it's really just to measure the amount of change from a certain point, right? I think that, and I was arguing this, I think that any baseline 1850 is okay. My preferable baseline is actually 1880 to 1920. And the reason why I say that is that you can go to the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies and look at their temperature anomaly graphs, and you can see that large portions of the Arctic and Antarctic were basically, we weren't registering any data from those areas pre-1880. So a lot of the climate data is just not reliable. You have to reconstruct climate temperatures for times back to 1750. So I just think the international consensus uses 1880 in the negotiations because at that time we are most reliably measuring temperatures from those areas.
Well, if you look at some of the earliest IPCC report, like the very first one, they go to 1750. Now, techniques have drastically improved. Granted, it's still proxy data, but they have drastically improved that we can, with little error, pretty much get a good handle on what the situation was 1750, what is usually taken as pre-industrial levels. Because here's why and this is a new thing. When they said, 1850 to 1900, that's a new thing. They actually changed it. They're being inconsistent with their earlier reports. And I'm going to get to in a little bit about what something meteorologists are doing. But when you go back to 1750, okay, there's actually been about a 0.2 degree warming between 1750 to 1850. So when they're reporting, that, it's about 1.2, 1.27, higher than that baseline, they are neglecting that 0.2 from the previous 100 years. So actually it's about 1.4 to 1.5. And if they were to, be consistent with their earlier reports, then right there, oh, we're at 1.5. Oh shit, we basically just blown past the goal of 1.5 with the Paris Accord. So to me, it was kind of as we discussed before, a bit of a political maneuvering there to suddenly, change the baseline. Here's something meteorologists do, and there's actually, I'm seeing a change in this as well. When you see a meteorologist, they like to do 30-year averages. So, for example, what was the average temperature from the period of 1981 to 2010? Okay, and then compare temperatures to that 30-year time period. Oh, temperatures have gone up this much, and so forth. Well, now, and they upgrade it every 10 years. So now the new 30-year average will be from 1991 to 2020. So now when you start looking at temperatures now, the temperatures haven't increased that much when compared to 1991 to 2020. But when you compare it to the same temperature to now 1981 to 2010, we see there's more of an increase. So what we're now seeing with the papers and a lot of the graphics is now we're going back to 1951 to 1980. So now the temperatures are being compared to that 30-year period, because it's now taken to be understood that starting in basically the mid-1970s is when things really started to increase exponentially. So, so you have to be really careful as to where you do your comparison, because as temperatures keep warming up, if you keep moving the goalposts, what you can compare it to, then it's going to give the appearance that it's going to be downplayed, and the increases are going to not seem as much as when you compare to an earlier time period. So, IPCC used to basically based it on 1750. Now they moved to the 1850, and that to me is first of all, it's inconsistent, and it's a bit disingenuous to see that. And as I said, we have now greatly improved our analyses of what's happened before in the past. I mean, we can now reconstruct with very high confidence, what the temperatures and oxygen levels and CO2 levels were back to basically PETM periods. In fact, some of the analyses go back to the KT extinction event, where they can, for the past 65 million years, have greatly increased our measurements with far less error, and so that we build a better picture of what the climatic conditions and situations were. So I saw that, and I said, oh, so that's why I said, well, it's only 1.2, because they moved the goalposts. If you compare it to 1750, going back to there, it's actually closer to the 1.5, which may still even be an underestimation. As Dr. James Hansen was putting forth today, he was putting out some information that the warming is actually starting to increase because the AME, the aerosol masking effect, is being greatly reduced. And so now, instead of the aerosols, the particulates reflecting some of the heat energy back, because there's less of aerosols in the atmosphere, now we're starting to see the warming even increase ever more so. So once again, there's an underestimation in looking at the reports. Going back to the oceans, again, they did not really give much, did not spend a lot of time, a lot of pages on the ocean. I just saw the latest data. When I did my ocean heat content video, at the time I made that video, the estimated measure of how much heat energy the oceans have absorbed was about 200 zetajoules. And zeta is 10 to the 21. So basically 200, so that's why 2 times 10 to the 23 joules of heat energy, of which 68% of that is in the upper 500 meters of the ocean. I just saw the latest results showing it's 220 zettajoules. So in the short few months from when I did the ocean heat content, the oceans have absorbed that much more energy. And the oceans have absorbed 93% of all the greenhouse gas emissions since 1971. The ocean's ability to continually to absorb heat energy and at the same time also means CO2 is going to drastically drop off. And when that happens, the CO2 level will dramatically increase ever more so. And as you continue to warm up the oceans, you're going to, solubility of gases decrease with increase in temperature. So saturation is going to be reached. So the ability to absorb more CO2 is going to drop. And as warming continues past, whatever CO2 is already dissolved in the waters will outgas back to the atmosphere, even adding further, accelerating the CO2 levels. So they basically didn't really go into any depth as they should have, in my opinion, as to the role of the oceans. And because of that heat energy, I'm preparing a video on it now of stuff in the lab to see. There is increased methane outages from the shelf system in the Arctic, and it's a twofold thing. You have the substrate thawing and melting because if there's ice in there, so you have a biogenic aspect. So you have microbial action that releases methane, but there's also, as you go further out onto the shelf to where it goes down to the slope, goes down to the basins, you now having basically the rock formations themselves are starting to split open due to the warming of the water, so that there's trapped methane bubbles and so on. They're being released as well. So that's more of a rock or origin, a thermogenic as opposed to biogenic origin. So you have two processes involved that are releasing more methane from the oceans into the atmosphere eventually. And this is all because of the heat energy that the oceans contain. So, so you're going to have, you have the methane from there. You have CO2 eventually not being absorbed by the oceans, so that's going to stay in the atmosphere. CO2 that's going to outgas back to the atmosphere from the ocean. All these are going to dramatically increase the CO2 levels, so that whatever we might want to try and do, the ocean is holding so much heat energy that a lot of that heat, now I'm talking in addition to the CO2, but a lot of that heat energy will diffuse into the atmosphere. What we're seeing now, all these effects, that's just 7% of all the greenhouse gas that we have emitted, from burning a fossil fuel. That's just 7%. Okay? So even if say just 25% of that heat energy that's in the ocean makes it to the atmosphere, and I'm really lowballing it there, that is good enough for an additional 4 degrees C of warming, to be quite blunt, just right that alone. So the situation is really extremely dire.
So 2 things. First, I say I think it is for our viewers, it is legitimate to have different baselines if you're asking a specific question. For example, what relative to today, what has been the amount of climate warming since 1950 to 1980? Some people were born between that time, so they might want to know, how much climate change have I seen over the course of my lifetime? But what is accurate to say is that in terms of understanding the totality of the anthropogenic effect on our climate, you do have to have calibrate a baseline that starts at 1750, because that's roughly when the human industrial project began. I think in the report, part of the problem is that AR1 came out in 1990. And so at the time, in 1990, I think we didn't have particularly good reconstructive proxies for those emissions in 1750. I think today those proxies are much better. But like you say, there's a lot of politics that are involved. And so policymakers don't want to necessarily be forced in a circle where they have to base policy off of the most demanding scientific case, right? And so that's part of the problem there as well. Moving it to 1850, I think, is a little bit better than 1880 to 1920. But still, there are these issues. But I think for our audience at home, the best thing to do is just like what Jim said. When you see these different baselines, you can do your own calculation in your head and tack on the additional amount of warming. And I think, Jim, in my climate research, I found that actually, when you include that pre-industrial period from 1750 to 1880, it's actually about 0.3 to 0.5 degrees Celsius warmer is what I found, which I guess is a little bit on the warmer edge of what you're saying. And then the second thing I was going to ask you is about the actual physics of heat diffusing from the ocean into the atmosphere. What does that physical process actually look like? What is the time scale for the percent of diffusion into the atmosphere from the ocean?
That's going to be a function of latitude, where you are. It's going to be a function of basically gradients. The greater the difference is, the greater that will be the gradient. One way to think about gradient is that, look at what's happening with the jet streams. The jet streams are slowing down. They're starting to meander all over the place, becoming more meridional versus zonal. But what's the jet stream? The jet stream is driven by differences in temperature and hence differences in pressure. So the greater the temperature gradient, the greater the pressure gradient, and you're going to have the difference flowing down the gradient. Well, if you start warming up the Arctic, and the Arctic's warming up 3 times faster than the rest of the planet, that gradient is not going to be as well defined. So things are going to slow down. Taking that to the oceans, you have to look and say, what's the heat energy content? What's the gradient? Okay, how much energy is in the ocean versus how much energy is in the atmosphere? So the greater that difference, the greater will be the diffusion. Now, this is where it gets a little trickier. The thermohaline flow, what we call the conveyor belt colloquially, is slowing down. I mean, when you have about 136 zettajoules in the upper 500 meters, that's stratifying the ocean. So the ability of the oceans to sequester not just the heat, but the CO2 down to depth is going to be greatly impaired and hampered. So now we got the CO2 and that heat staying in the upper layers. That makes it closer to the air-water interface, which means, if you have your differences in energy, it will diffuse into the atmosphere. Think about when you're walking along, in the countryside, whatever, and you have some stream or brook that's open in the wintertime. And what do you see right above the water there? You see what looks like steam, vapor. Okay? That's the latent heat that's in the water making its way to the atmosphere. You have to also factor in the fact that water has a much higher specific heat capacity than the air. So it's going to hold so much more heat. So if I have, say, a cubic meter of air and a cubic meter of water, the cubic meter of water is going to hold so much more heat than a cubic meter of air. And that's because to warm up the cubic meter of water, say 1 degree C, is going to take considerably more energy than that 1 cubic meter of air. So right there, we're setting up a differential that will then follow the gradient and flow, move to the atmosphere. This is why, people talk about the sea ice disappearing in the Arctic Ocean. And I just completed a 2-part video on this. The reason why is much more so than simply the air warming up and the air melting the ice from above, which is happening. It is a contributing factor. But you have all this basically latent heat energy, all this energy in the oceans moving into the Arctic Ocean from the Pacific side through the Bering, as well as from the Atlantic side through not just the Fram Strait, but also through the Barents Sea opening. There's so much heat energy there that heat diffuses upward and melts the ice from below, such that you have the heat there in, say, October, November. That heat is diffusing up. That prevents the ice from forming in the first place. It was the reason why we see the sea ice forming later in the year. And then coming around in the springtime, that heat diffusing upward because the water's still flowing in is melting the ice earlier. Well, as it melts through the ice, it's going to continue because it's latent heat. It's going to then diffuse into the atmosphere as well. So to look at this, you have to look at the differences in the heat energy, latent or sensible heat, and you have to look at the diffusion rates and the specific heat capacity. And all these things is what's controlling, the amount of diffusion that we'll have here. Now, as I said, I'm just saying it conservatively that, what's in the ocean can add an additional 4C to the overall global temperature. It could be much higher, to be quite honest. It will, depends how much that diffuses upwards.
I wanted to also ask, because, climate change is obviously very dynamic, right? So if you talk about increasing the global average temperature, it's going to lead to further degradation of the ice sheets. You have no idea. There is a lot of ice in both Greenland and Antarctica. I mean, just a stupendous wealth of ice in both of those landscapes. But as you warm global average temperature, you're going to be pushing a lot of that ice into the ocean rapidly. That is going to have a moderating effect, and it's also going to increase how much heat the ocean content can actually hold. So I do think, in some sense, at least in terms of those thermal dynamics, that the ice, the amount of ice, the amount of fresh water that's going to be introduced to the ocean system is going to act as if a moderator. I think in the long term, what ends up happening is that you will have some sort of moderation on temperature, but once all the ice is melted, or at least all the ice that is relatively close to the oceans is melted, all of that heat will be then transferred into warming the ocean directly and no longer melting ice. That's both true for the sea ice, but then for the eventuality that once the landlocked ice finally is degraded to such a state that it's not just rapidly pouring into the oceans, both in the high north and in the deep south. What's your comment on that?
Well, we have data that indicates that when you put a whole bunch of fresh water in the North Atlantic, the conveyor belt shuts down and there was at least a hemispheric cooling. We have the data for that. Wally Broker was the pioneer in doing that work. And there's a big debate right now, a big question, not so much a debate, but a big question right now, as there's a pile of fresh water that's building up in the Arctic Ocean. And the question is, what's going to happen to that fresh water? Will it stay in the Arctic Ocean, or is it going to be flushed out into the North Atlantic, adding more fresh water to the North Atlantic? And we've all seen the recent headline, oh, the Gulf Stream's in imminent danger of stopping and yada, yada, yada. Okay, put the hyperbole aside for the moment. Is the Gulf Stream slowing down, which means is AMOC slowing down? Because AMOC, when it sinks, pulls the Gulf Stream along. Is it slowing down? Yes. We have a number of teams, a team from Dalhousie University in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, has been leading the efforts of the last 20 years. A couple of teams out of Norway that have been measuring a slowdown in AMOC. Yes, that is happening. But because of the ocean heat content, this is what's different from what Wally Broker showed. When the AMOC can stop, slow down in the past, yes, there was a hemispheric cooling because the ocean was nowhere as warm as it is today. So today, if AMOC was a slow, even stop, you're going to see a regional cooling. And that region is going to be, Iceland, UK, Scandinavia. Sea ice melt will continue. And here's the reason why. A lot of people are not aware of this. The Gulf Stream is about, on average, goes about 800 meters deep. Okay. The water that moves in through the Fram Strait comes in at levels deeper than 800 meters. So now the question is, what is the source? And it's called the North Atlantic Intermediate Water. What is the source of this water? The source of the water is the Mediterranean Sea. And the Mediterranean Sea is very warm water. It's also very salty water. Now, density of water is determined by the temperature and salt contents, what we call salinity. So the warmer the water is, the less dense it will be, but the more salt you have, the more dense it will be. So the question has always been, which has a higher density? Cold, not as saline water, or warm and very saline water? And the answer is, you just got to see what the hell happens. Okay, so when you have this warm, salty water moving into the Atlantic through Gibraltar, and what it does is, because of the density characteristics, the temperature and the salinity taken together, that water dives in at about 1,000 to 1,500 meters. It is that water that moves through the Fram Strait, because the Fram Strait has a deep enough opening to allow that. The Barents Sea opening is a shallow shelf area, so it's not going to. So you're going to see less warm water moving in through there. So that water from the Mediterranean is moving into the Arctic Ocean, and that is a major contributor into melting the ice. And I would argue will continue to melt the ice and keep the ice either freezing, keep the ice from freezing, so it freezes late in the year, melts early in the year, or maybe eventually you get a BOE. So you have to look at that. That's where it comes in. It's the Mediterranean water. So the ice is still going to be disappearing. That's my assessment of it. Yes, you're going to melt all. You have all that heat there, so you're going to still continue to melt Greenland and Antarctica. And yes, you're going to have the fresh water pooling on the surface there, so that you may shut down AMOC, but you're still going to have that influence of the Mediterranean moving up north with all that heat energy and keeping the ice open. The real danger of AMOC slowing down, and this is coupled with all that heat energy in the upper 500 meters, is the fact that you're going to get extreme stratification of the oceans. And when you get extreme stratifications of the ocean, we now have to look at what is this going to do in terms of biological productivity. So you get biological productivity if the basic two-step process, and this is extremely simplified, to have productivity in any aquatic system, a pond, the ocean, a lake, what have you, is that you need a mixing event to stir up everything, get the nutrients into the photic zone, followed by a stratification event. You do need stratification to lock in those nutrients within the photic zone. Then the phytoplankton can do their thing, and then the zooplankton eat the phytoplankton, etc., etc. If you would just have continual stratification, without any breakdown of the stratification to have remixing. If you just have continuous stratification and nothing mixed into the photic zone, nothing to infuse, no infusion of nutrient, productivity will shut down eventually. And when it shuts down eventually, the whole food web is going to collapse. How many people around the planet rely on the oceans for the source of protein? So that is, to me, the real danger, the real concern with AMOC slowing down is that productivity will eventually either, at best case scenario, reduce greatly, or worst case scenario, totally shut down.
So, Jim, I have a question. Does this mean so basically you're saying that there's not enough addressed in the report about the oceans? I mean, seriously, that's the whole thing.
Yeah,
that's your point. Okay.
That's my point, yeah.
Antonio's point is about we're not going to have enough for infrastructure. I mean, it's been really an interesting conversation. I'm sitting back listening and watching the chat. We have some questions, so that's really why I'm here, guys. I'm here to get the questions going. I'm sneaking myself right in that way. All right. And I haven't seen that we've had a toilet flush of the show yet either, so maybe we'll have a question that deserves one of our famous toilet flushes of the day. All right. So
I'll take oceans for 400, Sandy.
You'll take. Oh, okay. Well, there you go. Then I've just got to flush. Sorry, but here we go. Yay! And we got the applause going too. We'll pick that up. All right. So anyway, here we go. Well, Jim McHenry. Here's the first one because he said, "Was there anything in the IPCC report about the oceans?" Because I read the review, but I didn't read the whole report. So what do you think?
Well, sure, there was things in the ocean, but let's just say greatly lacking in detail. For what I've just been blathering on about for the last 5 minutes or so.
That's good. That's all right. Listen, I'm going to get some other comments up here, and thank you guys.
Well,
also.
I had another.
Yes, Antonio.
I had another question for Jim.
Okay.
So, or comment / question, but when you're talking about these huge changes, and again, I remind people that planet Earth is 75% water. It really should be planet water. But you also
Oceanus.
Wait, it's not coffee?
The ocean will be experiencing as these different conveyor belts break down. It's going to be experiencing very regional differences, right? So in around the equatorial band, the oceans, the water is going to essentially pile up. That's where you're going to see that stratification process, because there's not going to be any addition. There's not going to be much additional mixing, right? You're not going to have a lot of glacial melt introducing fresh water into the tropical regions like you're going to see in the northern Atlantic, and like you're also going to see in the South Atlantic, in parts of the Indian Ocean, in the Pacific that touch Antarctica. So I see that regionally, we're going to see a moderation in temperatures due to the mixing of all the fresh water coming into the surrounding oceans. But particularly around the tropics, it's going to be a monumental dead zone because as these currents break down, you're going to see a lot less mixing, particularly around the tropic regions.
Well, okay. Keep in mind that what we colloquially call the conveyor belt is a major heat distribution mechanism for the planet. You take warm water from the equatorial regions, low latitude, move it to the higher latitudes. You take cooler waters from higher latitudes, move it to the lower latitudes. If AMOC stops, what you're going to see is you're going to actually see extreme. This is what we've seen in the past. You're going to see extreme differences in temperature, so that hemispherically, at least in the upper latitude, is going to cool down dramatically, but the equatorial region is going to heat up dramatically. As far as the stratification goes, in the high latitude, density of seawater is more determined by salinity, by the salt content. So what we usually refer to as a pycnocline is really more of a halocline. In the tropics, because the salt content tends to be about the same across, it's temperature driven. So you get to see more of a thermocline. But the point is, you're still going to see stratification across the water, because dumping all that fresh water is going to cause a stratification at high latitude. Now you're going to continually to heat up the equatorial waters. You're going to see continuous stratification of that. So stratification will take place. It's just, is it going to be temperature or salt driven is basically what it comes down to. As it is now, the the equatorial zone is pretty much not biologically active, not much biological productivity taking place, because there is, in essence, right now, almost a permanent thermocline at in equatorial water. Where you see some of the production is more temperate water. But even so, the middle of gyres, you've got one in the North Atlantic, South Atlantic, North Pacific, etc. Oceanic gyres are biologically not productive at all. The only reason why you take the Southern Ocean as an example, why that's so productive, is because you have an upwelling that takes place, what we call the Antarctic Divergence Zone or region. What's the source of that upwelling? A branch of the conveyor belt. That upwelling brings nutrients to the surface. So then you have the phytos and the krill go do their things, and you got the baleen whale and so on and so forth. So now if you shut down the conveyor belt, you're going to eventually stop that upwelling, which is very vital for that whole ecosystem there. And that ecosystem will collapse eventually. The Southern Ocean is really the most productive open ocean region on the planet. Where most of the oceanic productivity is where you have what we call Ekman pumping or Ekman shelf processes, where you have an upwelling that throws nutrients onto the shelf, and then you can have your productivity take place from that. Sandy?
Give me this, Sandy.
Sorry, see, I'm not multitasking very well. I got thrown off in the beginning. I got completely thrown off in the beginning. All right, let's go to RM. No, I did that. Oh, okay. So AMOC has slowed the stream by 16%, right? Is that true? Is that accurate?
I'm not aware of data correlating AMOC and jet streams. If the jet stream is slowing, that's more due to atmospheric temperature and pressure differentials. I'm unaware of any connections, quantified connections between those two.
Did that person be Gulf Stream?
The Gulf Stream?
You're talking Gulf Stream? That actually makes more sense then. So yes, the Gulf. Don't forget, if AMOC slows, the sinking is what pulls the Gulf Stream along. So if AMOC slows, then so will the Gulf Stream slow.
Okay. All right. So the next one, I will pull up. I should spin the wheel here. Gazer. Hi, Gazer. Will any geomessing solve this? I don't think there will be, but it is a question. We know what geomessing is, don't we?
They're talking about geoengineering, right?
Well, I mean, how many varieties of geoengineering are there? Quite a few.
Yeah, it's quite a few. Well, the problem with geoengineering is very simple. There are always parameters that are unaccounted for, interactions that are unanticipated, so that you cannot predict an outcome. Think of chaos theory. Any slight perturbations in any initial conditions will lead to wildly different results. I mean, I'll give you an example. And people do not try, especially teenagers, do not try this at home. But let's say you have a full open gallon can of paint, and you clear out your garage, you put it in the middle, and then you aim a soccer ball at it, and you kick the soccer ball, it slams into the can of paint, and it just splatters everywhere. guess what? You're never ever going to be able to reproduce that exactly, because the different viscosity and the molecular interaction of the paint itself, how you strike the soccer ball, where's the soccer ball hit with what energy, and so forth. So lots of times, you hear these geoengineering schemes, and I'm like saying, yeah, but what about this? What about that? What about this? Have you considered this possible interaction? There's just so many complex variables, and complex not in the sense of A plus BI, but there's so many complex variables and their interaction that you cannot accurately model or predict the outcome. That oftentimes that what you're hoping for is not the result that you get, because something unexpected shows up. A classic example of, let's put iron in the form of a sulfate solution into the ocean to seed the phytoplankton, because iron is a micronutrient for phytoplankton. Well, they tried that experiment several times, and all the times they tried it, it was a whopping failure. Because first of all, you do your testing in a closed system, and then you throw it into the open ocean, where there's so many upwellings and downwellings and horizontal currents and mixing and so on and so forth, and all the other chemical species and temperature differentials. It's just not going to go.
Antonio?
Well, Jim, I would say, I think I think about this from a policy planning perspective, right? That let's say that you are one of the advisors to me, and I was, one of the top American political officials, and I had to make a decision on what to do in response to the climate crisis, given the data that you just presented. What I would prepare people to then understand is what you said in terms of how a policy planner would approach that reality isn't that we shouldn't geoengineer. What the policy planner would internalize is that our society should prepare for the intentional intervention of humans into the oceans and into the atmosphere large scale. That there is likely then, if we're serious about any chance of surviving, policymakers will enact a slew of geoengineering schemes. Some of these schemes will be regionally developed. Some of these schemes, as you say, will be based off of basically dealing with the consequences of other schemes. But this will be this is now the world that, really the generation since the beginning of industrialism has committed us to. And obviously, the other consequence, if we don't become quote unquote God, or at least playing that role, the consequence is, out of control warming. Um, Particularly when I was talking about, the collapse of the ice sheets, I was really thinking about 2070 and beyond. But the atmosphere is going to warm really quickly before we see a complete disintegration of the ice shelves. And so, since that crisis is upon us, I think politically, what we are going to see is that governments will begin enacting and implementing large swathes of regional and global engineering schemes. Um, we saw the Chinese and the Indians are going straight forward with a weather modification. The Chinese have taken large swaths of the desert and turned them into not just savanna, but almost forest land. And there's a lot of problems with that. A lot of it's monoculture. A lot of the trees they use are not proper or appropriately sexually reproductive. A lot of those trees are hypermasculine trees. That happens when you use the same tree to clone over and over again. So there's a lot of biological problems with that, but you'll see that governments are going to begin interfering with their climate and geography in ways to try to mitigate at least the local regional weather impacts of climate change.
Well,
well,
there's a couple. There's a couple of things going on right now. Botanists are actually finding out that as the temperatures warm up, that the plants are being stressed because plants, like any organisms, have preferred temperature ranges. And what they're finding right now is that many of the trees are actually switching to more respiration than photosynthesizing. So, because usually, because trees do
really?
respire, they respire at night. They take the glucose they've made during the day and they use it to respire at night. Well, now they're also finding out that they're respiring also during the daytime because they're stressed out. And when you look at a lot of the crops that humans rely on, without getting into the wonky biochemistry, but many of those plants are called C3 plants. And C3 plants prefer temperatures under 85 degrees Fahrenheit. C4 plants can handle warmer conditions above 85, of which I think there's maybe one or two plants that humans use, one of them being corn. But even they have an upper limit that if it gets too warm, it starts being deleterious to them. So plants are now photosynthesizing less, which means that's additional CO2 in the atmosphere, drawing down more oxygen. And we know that the Arctic is now a carbon source because of the methane issue. Now the Amazon is now also a carbon source. And look at all the fires happening right now. It will be interesting to see, to quantify how much carbon those fires all over the planet, have been introduced into the atmosphere. Now, of course, you can say, well, now you've thrown a lot of particulate matter, so maybe there'll be an offsetting, looking at, again, the AME aspect, that maybe some of those particulates will be, help at least regionally have a cooling effect. Again, that remains to be studied, measured, quantified, and so forth. But there's a lot of other things going on that is going to add to the CO2 level that will then add to the warming. And don't forget, there's about a 10 to 15 year lag. So what we're feeling and experiencing now is based on CO2 levels of 10, 15 years ago. Current CO2 level, we're not going to feel or experience the effects of that until about 10, 15 years down the line. So you ain't seen nothing yet.
Okay, let's see here. We ain't seen nothing yet. I wish if I didn't get a copyright infringement, we planned that, I could have played the song.
And I was going to say really quickly, as Sandy
Yes,
brings
you
up
could really
question,
quickly. Yes.
that in the IPCC reports, I know this is kind of almost small talk now, but all emissions from militaries are omitted from IPCC emission calculations. So
They are? How about cruise ships? Oh,
I'm not sure of cruise ships, but I know that militaries are
jeez.
omitted because they don't release their numbers on
Wow.
in the
So
United
what
States
you
military alone.
so
Wow.
what you're saying is there's a hidden source of additional potential warming.
Or at
Oh,
least
it's a very large,
not factored in.
large,
Holy crap.
very
Yeah.
large source of additional emissions because it's the totality. There's almost no government, no militaries reporting, and basically the best that we do is that in the United States you might have some professors here and there, they'll do their estimates, but none of that is added in the IPCC. And so the United States alone, its military alone, admits the size, almost the size of I forget what country, but it's basically like a medium size emitting country.
Oh,
Just as
lovely. Oh,
um,
jeez.
and that's emitted from our numbers. That's not included in our numbers.
that's a whole show in itself.
Wow, that's
I wonder if those numbers are calculated and they're just, they've got to be calculated somewhere. Obviously, the military must calculate their own emissions numbers, and somebody has to
Oh,
calculate
we
this
do,
stuff.
but we don't
Yeah.
report that to the IPCC.
No.
What
Well,
happens is
then,
the
a
IPCC
FOIA.
process that we
that's
rely on, and
that's a huge point.
this is another thing that people have to understand about the so-called numbers that we're agreeing to, is that the numbers are what other the countries are reporting. So whatever the Indian numbers are, those aren't what we say. That's what the Indians say. Whatever the Chinese numbers are, that's what the Chinese say. And so these very politically charged processes, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of internal emissions that either due to bad accounting techniques or just, I mean, think about, my city, Winston-Salem.
Yeah.
We're not accounting our emissions here. They're just using proxies for our region. So if you actually had really good emissions counting, you'd probably find that we're actually emitting a little bit more than what we think. And all this is really being left out of the IPCC process. And so countries obviously have political reasons why they don't want to include their militaries, why they don't want more accurate and precise accounting measures, because that would make their challenges even larger.
Oh my gosh, it's overwhelming. I'm moving on. It is. I'm sorry. It just is. All right. So, environmentalist who's been very active in the chat tonight, and we're going to give environmentalist just a great applause. Thank you for being with us. Okay. So, here's your question. Kara Sea is one of the most highly radioactive places on the planet, and as glaciers melt, that will be released into the ocean. How does that impact the heating of the ocean? Wow, I think he means Kara Sea. Well,
I'm thinking.
okay, wait. Where's my doo? We'll do this while you think. We'll drip.
Well, it depends on what
Okay.
the radioactive species we're talking about. I mean, this is this is really not my area of expertise. I do know Wally Broca wrote the book called Radionuclides or Traces in the Sea, where he actually look at naturally occurring radioactive isotopes and other non-radioactive isotopes to determine water masses, water mass movement, surface and deeper currents, and so on. What happens to that radioactivity? Well, depending on the species, if organisms come into contact with it, ingest it, well, that's going to cause a problem for at least the organisms. Beyond that, I really don't know what else to say. Sorry, I don't have a better answer.
Okay, well, you don't have to be perfect, and that's really okay. Nobody is perfect, and nobody knows everything. Okay, we had Jim. Why does the IPCC not use land-based temperature increases versus ocean temperature increases separately, as well as they're mushing both together?
Well,
Antonio, you have an insight into the methodology on this one?
well, in the long form reports, they certainly do look at how much the ocean has warmed compared separately from how much surface temperatures have. But obviously, if you combine the two, that's a global average. And I got to remind people that when we see IPCC reports, there's really two different reports that we're talking about. There's the report for policymakers, which is really brief. So if you're worried about the lack of detail in the actual assessment, there's almost no detail in the actual assessment for policymaker. Remember, the actual assessment is literally thousands of pages long. The assessment for policymakers is between like 30 and 50 pages. And so you do got to make that differentiation that a lot of stuff is obviously then not included in the summary for policymakers. And so they're probably not going to detail for policymakers the difference between ocean temperature and land surface temperature. Oh, that's really, really important. As we know, the interior of large continents is going to warm 2 to 3 times faster than the global average. They're very vulnerable to changes in the climate. So that's not something that should be overlooked. But if you look at, for example, in the U.S. climate assessment, they showed that by the middle of the century, the U.S. will be between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius warmer than the 1880 baseline. So that's just the U.S. But the IPCC doesn't use and look at that type of close data. Again, they're trying to produce a generalized global analysis of climate change for policymakers.
Another thing to keep in mind is when you see the recreated maps of temperatures, and then they compare and they track the anomalies from whatever baseline they're using. When they determine the what they call surface temperature, keep in mind it's really a 2 meter above the layer, whether it's the ground or the water surface. That's where they're taking the measurements. So it's 2 meters above, and then of course that's all averaged out. Now, depending on where you're at, if you just shove a thermometer into the ground, depending on the characteristics, that temperature is going to be much warmer than the air temperature, or depending on the time of season, much cooler. But for example, in the Arctic, the ground temperature is going to be warmer than the air temperature in the wintertime, just because, insulatory factors of the snow, specific heat. There we go again with that guy. But so keep in mind when you look at, here's the average global temperature, and they show the planet and they show all the temperature ranges. They're basing that on 2 meter above wherever they're at. And of course, a lot of it is extrapolation because you don't have measuring devices everywhere. So, so a lot of it is going to be extrapolative.
Okay, I am coming back with, and I don't know if you hear I hear an echo in myself again.
Yeah, I do.
This is all night. I don't know what's wrong. So,
Should I leave and come back really quickly?
you want to try, and I'll read a question. I don't know if it's you. Go ahead. He'll come back. Nope, it's not him. So, that's more I will have to find out, guys, about what's wrong here. No, it's not. It's not you.
Okay.
No. All right. Nothing else on.
It's quantum tunneling.
Yeah, I have nothing else on. I have no freaking clue. But we've been an hour and 13 minutes. We're doing a pretty good one. I guess I don't have. I mean, we went through most of the questions, and we have a lot of good comment. And hello, unapologetic vegan. A lot of good comments. Good night, Karen Reese. Because Kim says no echo, but I hear it. I'm going to have to do some audio testing. Oh boy, that sounds daunting. So guys, all in all with this report, what difference is it making? I feel like, of course, we need a difference, and it was all over the news for 5 minutes, and now what? Now what?
Yeah, now what?
And some great videos out there I saw. Some really good ones.
Once
Now
again,
what?
the politicians refuse to really grow a pair and really, implement, changes in policies. So to them, it's just business as usual. I hate to say. I mean,
Yeah.
scientists. And here's another thing with the IPCC is that oftentimes they have to play down to the lowest denominator. So that's seriously, which is
Yeah.
another reason why you see such lowballing. Whether it's a linear versus an exponential, or it's all really on warmed up 1.1 degrees C, maybe instead of 1.8, 1.9, or 2.1 or whatever. So it tends to be playing down to the lowest denominator, which also, I think, undermines the effort that's being done.
What have they done right?
They've gotten the scientific community together.
Good.
They've gotten
Yeah,
experts from all around the
right.
world to contribute. So the scientific community is really in working together. So that's a very good positive.
Okay.
Having been part of that myself.
If we took the recommendations of the IPCC seriously, we would be actually seriously reducing our emissions.
It would be a wonderful thing.
Not in line with what we need to be doing.
Yeah.
But we would actually be addressing the crisis. But in the United States, I think that's why I started with kind of that political monotone, is because I want people to understand, when the IPCC report is released, it is really thrown away in the United States. It does not reach the level of policy planning. In the United States, the way that we are going to address climate change is through infrastructure. And the IPCC reports they have no bearing on the conversations in the halls of Congress or in the Senate. So it's almost as if this report didn't even come out in the United States political class. That's the part that I'm trying to...
Bernie and Sheldon Whitehouse.
Well, right. So you have maybe a total of 13 people out of 535 that acknowledge the existence of the report and understand that it needs to be implemented in some capacities into our policies. And those people are called the radical extremists. So again, people have to understand that the reports themselves are very watered down. They're very, very conservative, but yet they are still, even in that context, sounding the alarm. And then
it's Code Red. Code Red, guys. Code Red. What does that mean? We are so what? I don't know. I mean, what are we going to do? I got the hat. Where's my hat? I don't know where my hat is.
We're in deep doo-doo?
We're in deep doo-doo. We're in deep doo-doo. Well, but even though we're in deep doo-doo, we're in deep doo-doo together. All right, guys, listen, it's been an hour and 19 minutes. I'm going to end with the video. Hopefully that won't echo the one from the beginning of the show. And I'm going to give each of you a minute to say your closing and what you'd like to do the next show, possibly, if you have any thoughts.
Okay, I guess I'll start. Well, first of all, thanks to Antonio and Sandy, and to everyone who participated. What can I say in closing? Pay attention to the oceans. Oceans are real drivers of climate. I'll just leave it there.
Okay. The oceans. Yay!
Well, thank you again, our viewers, for tuning in tonight. And thank you, Jim, for your exquisite and very detailed commentary on what's happening in our oceans. And what I would say to our viewers is pay attention to your congressmen and women and push them on the science. It's very easy to pick up the phone, call them, and challenge their office on these issues. And
there you go.
That will do more than what you think. And that is actually something that I do almost weekly. So you'll be surprised how far a little goes.
You little activist, you. Absolutely. I love it. It's great. Listen, guys, please like and subscribe. If you have not subscribed, it helps. And make sure you like the stream. And don't forget our little, fundraiser. It keeps the subscriptions on, and it keeps me being able to do this for you. And so I thank you very much for all of you that actually do come to the Buy Me a Coffee, because I appreciate it. And Jim, I hope you're using that damn mic I sent you. I don't know. You figure it out. He will. All right, guys. Good night. I'm going to play the video from the beginning, and hopefully there's no echo. And I'm sorry about that. I'll figure it out. It's called tech support.
Good night, all.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Congress has ignored the great existential threat of our time, and that is climate change. You don't have to believe me. Take a look at the IPCC report. If we do not act boldly and immediately all over this planet, the world that we will be leaving our children and grandchildren will be increasingly unhealthy and uninhabitable.
To the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Earth could exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming limit in 2 decades and 2 degrees by the middle of the century. A report released Monday shows the trend may be irreversible even if emissions are pulled to net zero.
Since the last assessment report in 2013, there have been important advances in climate science worldwide. During these years, climate scientists filled in gaps in observations of past climate. They improved climate models and developed new ways to combine many types of evidence. As a result, today we have the clearest picture of how the Earth's climate functions and how human activities affect it.